Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Now I'm not feeling so comfortable because I'm going to talk about switching from UI router to the new router. I didn't know you were part of the community around it. Anyway, this is the title of my talk. My name is Kaufman. I'm the head of Angular development in a company named 500 Tech, based in Israel, in Tel Aviv. I'm doing Angular for years now, so I've been developed, trained, and consult about Angular, I think, for the past 4 years, maybe more. I'm also a community activist. Is there any musicians in the crowd? Rock stars? No one? Really? Only rock stars developers. Anyway, if you like, stay tuned, check this out. It's going to be the first Angular open source band, and all of you can contribute. So, not yet, not yet. It's going to be the next big thing, so take your guitar out of the closet and get ready. But anyway, I should warn you, if you're like me and you start your day by drinking your coffee from an Angular cup, strange things can happen later on. But we're not here to talk about this. We're here to talk about learning some new things. So, as we all know, the new Angular router is stable, at least, but we had a lot of adventures with this model, and those adventures caused many Angular developers to be a little bit afraid or confused, and even not sure if they want to use this one. As a teacher and as a developer, I know that when I want to learn something new, it's usually easier to compare it to something that I'm already familiar with, so it will lead to success. This is an original pictures of two Angular developers who just discovered how easy to use the new Angular router. Too excited, if you ask me. Anyway, this was a very important day back there, ancient history, when the ng-route, the route service, was pulled out of the Angular 1 source, and the UI router project just stepped in. I haven't seen the show of hands before. How many of you familiar with UI router? Of course. So UI router is really it's a great project. It rocks for now. And it's even evolved, and you promised support on Angular 2 and even React and stuff. But I think that you should all considering check out the new Angular router. There is some good points for me. It's very opinionated, but I like that it's a consistent API and patterns such like the Angular core itself. I really like that lazy loading is straight out of the box. It's very important for large-scale applications that I'm involved in. I like that it synced with Angular releases, so I won't be afraid that if Angular core will be updated to the next version, something will break. But if we put aside all those powerful features and stuff, I really think that it's easy to use. And this is the selling point for me for using the Angular router, because I like complex things to be easy to use. Maybe not so easy and straightforward to understand the implementation details, but easy to use. So before we start comparing, and I hope that you will discover that you're actually already familiar with the Angular router because of your UI router background, let's take a quick one on the router role. So the router basically is manage our application state, the navigation between application states, and is responsible to update the UI. And in Angular 2, when we're talking about the UI, we are all familiar with this diagram. We've seen it a lot. So the router job is serialize our component structure into a URL. Spoiler, we can do fun stuff too. All right, so let's get started. This talk is going to be, I hope so, fun and light, because I'm not going to deep dive inside those implementations. I will take a step back, and as a user and as a developer, we just compare our familiar familiar router with a new router. So it all starts with configuration, which the Angular CLI will solve eventually, but let's see the difference. So every Angular application starts with a module. So we create a module, and we declare the dependency. We declare that our app module, our root module, is depend on the UI router module. And then we need to pass, to inject the state provider service into our config function. And then we can call the state method passing route configuration one at a time. So I think this is better. In Angular 2, we just create a module, and we ask for the router module by calling the forRoot method. We'll talk about it in a minute, and providing all the root configuration all at once. So basically, less lines of code to doing exactly the same thing. Don't get too excited, like me. Anyway, there's two options to get the router module by calling the forRoot or the forChild, and there's actually a basic difference between them. The forRoot will provide the router module with the router singleton service, and the forChild will provide all the moving parts, but without this router service. But to put it in other words, it means that in a typical application, you basically call the router module forRoot only once to get the router service instantiated only once. All right? Cool. Let's move forward. So the UI router by default is composing its URLs using the hash, as we all know. And if we want to change it, we actually need to inject another service into the config, the location provider, and then set it to HTML5 mode. The new Angular router is the exact opposite, so it will work in HTML5 mode out of the box. But if we want to configure it, we just pass an object and set the use hash to true, and that's it. So again, from my opinion, less line of code, much more simple. Let's take a look at some more configuration of the new router. There is not a lot of configuration that we can configure right now with the Angular router, but the initial navigation set to false will protect the router from unexpected results. It will not. It will override the default behavior when the router, when we refresh the browser, is trying to resolve the URL into the state tree. We can pass a custom error handler, which is very useful, and then we can catch in one central point all of the potential navigation errors and deal with them, keep our console clean. And the enable tracing, I mean, we've got Augury, and it's a great tool, and let's use it a lot, but as you heard before, sometimes to log things to the console really worked it out. So by setting the enable tracing to true, I just get a log to the console with all of the routing events. Can be very useful. Finally, just to compare, the UI router, when it's come to templates, we build our links using the UI href directive, and we use the UI view directive as a placeholder for our views. And in the new Angular router, the syntax and the idea is pretty similar. All right? So you already see that it's not such a big deal, and all of you can do it. Let's go through over the basic stuff that we are used to do for years with the UI router and see how we do it with the Angular router. So let's start with the most basic thing. How do we define a state? So we provide a name, a URL, and a template, or a directive, or even a component in later releases. And in the Angular router, we just need to provide a path, and the Angular router will understand how to parse the URL by this given path. And we can't point this path to a template or something similar. We just point it to a component. And we refer that component by type. All right? So again, less code, same idea. What about nested childs? One of the great features of UI router. So in UI router, we're doing it by using the dot notation in the state name, like this example, hello.child. But in Angular router, we just build a familiar data structure. So if a certain route has some children, we just create an array and pass, again, state configuration inside of it. But this is the fun part of Angular router. If we like to load those routes lazy, all we need to do is replace the children, not with a koala bear. It might work, but haven't tried before, with load children, and just provide a path to the bundle. The bundle is provided for you from a Webpack, and the Angular CLI will support it, so it's really transparent. And just by changing the children to load children, we've got a lazy loaded module with all the defined routes right out of the box. Let's talk about parameters, very important and basic feature. So we are familiar with this syntax, So in UI router, in the URL, we can define a route parameter. And if we got a query parameter, we need to predefine it. When we want to consume it, in our controller, we inject the state params, and we've got an access to those params. So pretty straightforward. But in Angular 2, we've got observables. Observable is not an animal, yeah? Just to make sure that we're on the same line. Sometimes you get confused. I should replace the picture. Don't use the animal. Love your animals. Anyway, the familiar syntax. So I can define some route params. If I got query params, I don't need to define it. It doesn't need to know what my query params ahead. So this is the Angular router. And when I consume it, the only different inside the component is if I subscribe to the route params or subscribe to the route query params. So consist, and for my opinion, much more easier. Let's talk about resolving data. So in Angular 1, usually I will write a function like this, which return a promise. And inside the route config, I will use the resolve property. In these objects, all the keys, in this case the username, will become an injectable. So I can inject the username to my controller. Again, straightforward. Unless you've got tons of things that you want to resolve, then it's become a little less more comfortable. And in Angular 2, the same principle. So instead of a function, I created a class. I called it resolve service. I'm implementing an interface. Angular is written with TypeScript. We can use it if we like. This interface contains only one method, the resolve method, which return a promise, just like before. And on the route configuration, again, I'm using the resolve. I'm passing the username, I'm pointing this username to this resolve service. The router will invoke the resolve method, all right? But this time, this username doesn't become an injectable. In my component, if I want to grab it, I'm just pluck it out of route data. It's an observable. Again, consist and easy, all right? So this is how we resolve data that we fetch asynchronously. But what about just putting some static data on our state object? So in UI router, instead of resolve, we're using the data and put some static data. And if you want to consume it, now we don't inject the state params, we inject another service, the state object itself. And from the state objects, we can extract the data property, just like this. In Angular router, Angular 2, same syntax, so you already know how to use it. But the great thing about that Angular router doesn't care if the data is coming from the resolve data is async or static, so I don't need to change my code. I can still just pluck it outside of the raw data. If I got some data that has been resolved and some static data, it will merge to the same object. All right? Cool. So this is the interface that defined the route config in the Angular router. We already know about 50% of our options, which is great from our opinion. Very easy to learn. So let's talk about lifecycle. I think we're all familiar with that code. When in UI router, when an important event happening, it broadcasts from the root scope. So in any other scope, we can just register to a particular event and provide a callback. And in the world of observables and Angular router, we don't need this. We just subscribe to router event, and that's it. So each event that will be emitted or dispatched, we can handle it. Is there anyone here prefer the first option? Just to make sure. No. All right. Another great feature of the new Angular router is guards. And guards help us to protect certain states from being activated. And this is actually a very common scenarios, but while working with UI router, it's not really straightforward to implement how do I protect a state, how to implement some kind of authentication or rules or something similar. So in Angular 2 again, I'm creating a class. I called it canActivateAdmin. I'm implementing optionally the canActivate interface, which contain only one method, canActivate. It can be sync, it can be async, it doesn't really matter. And I just stuck it in the canActivate array. And this is an array, which means that I can put a bunch of classes, and all of them should resolve to be true eventually in order to this route to be activated. And we've got 3 more, excuse me. 3 more guards. I think the naming is pretty straightforward. So can activate the child, can I deactivate, and the one that I like the most, can load. I actually can protect a lazy loaded module from being loaded, which is very nice. All right, so the last feature I want to compare is multiple views. How many of you have used this feature? Just out of curiosity. A bunch of you, all right, great. So we can pass a view object to the UI router and map certain templates or controllers or components to different placeholders. And in Angular router, Angular 2, we've got the same idea. This time we're using the router outlet component, and we can give it a name. So I can specify that a certain route like this is, targeting to a certain outlet. But the great thing about that now it can be serialized into a URL. It seems a little strange, but now you've got a URL that indicates how to render multiple components together, which is a great thing. You can save it, you can restore it. All right. So it was only 20 minutes, and we get an overview of all the basic features and check how similar them, compare them to our familiar UI router. And as you can all guess, and you already know, the Angular router is powerful, and we just scratch the surface. We've got a lot to learn. The good news is that Angular 2 is written with TypeScript. So I find myself a lot of times, most of the times, before I'm even open up the docs, just going through the source code. Because it's written with TypeScript and everything is typed, and I've got an interface for almost everything, it's really easy and readable. So I think that the first thing you should do as a developer, before you jump to Google or Stack Overflow or the official docs, is try to go over the source code. It's a really great experience comparing to Angular 1. And if you like to learn from the source, this is my blog of choice, Victor Savkin, which happened to be the one who developed the router. So again, you learn straight from the source. And personally, I bought his book, which write a book about a router. I think it's a great thing that a developer of a certain module is actually writing a book and provides some more insights, not just how to use, how to understand the ideas behind the router. So really recommend it. Anyway, that's it for me. I really hope that this short talk was inspired you to, make you feel more comfortable with the new router, and you can make the switch and really start to use it. So, thank you very much.